Hello everybody, hope you're doing marvellously well. We're big, we're bad, and we're back with another Frequently Asked Questions Friday, FAQ Friday. I hope you all had a rather marvellous week. It's been busy here, we've been multitasking a whole bunch of fun things, and there's some really great questions this week. But first, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe. It's really fantastic if you can subscribe, and there's a little notifications bell, which means you'll be notified when we put up a new video. And of course, you can go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. Knowing that I need to learn so much to even feel a little comfortable working with shortcuts and find my way around Pro Tools, what would you recommend me to begin with so I have a bit of fun and still get an acceptable result without needing to dive into every little detail and studying for months before I can even start recording at all? Some simple tricks or obvious rules that I might have overlooked. If I was starting all over again, or more importantly, if I was mentoring somebody on a one-to-one situation, I would be encouraging them to do this first. Listen, get your drum track, play it down. When you hear something on top or behind or something that doesn't feel quite right, then edit it. That would be the way I would start. I believe really strongly that one of the faults that I think I learned and many of us learned is we learn all the tools too early. We should be learning why we need the tools. Does that make sense? I feel like if I'm listening to a fully recorded track and I hear things that I want to change, that's so much better than just changing them for the sake of it. There's been so many times where I've seen a drum track recorded and then just edited tight. And then a bass line, edited tight. Guitar, edited tight. That's not listening, that's just editing. So if you're starting off from scratch with Pro Tools or whatever DAW you've got, just take some recordings and listen to it and just learn how to manipulate things that you hear an issue with, rather than learning a skill to just edit everything perfectly. I think the best Pro Tools engineers I've ever worked with know how to do that. They know how to listen and find something, maybe a relationship between all the instruments that's slightly out of time and just nudge that, as opposed to timing the whole track. They just find little moments to just tweak it in. In the same way when we used to cut tape, or more importantly, when you just used to punch in more often until it got right. You know, one of the skills that's being lost is great production. I don't necessarily mean from the perspective of choosing parts and all that stuff. I mean from the perspective of working an artist. If you're recording and the guitar player's not in time, try another couple of takes till they're in time. It'll make your editing a lot easier. So I think for you, just learn the things that you need to learn. Start working, start recording, and then editing things subtly that you hear issues with. And you will teach yourself to listen first, and that's the most important thing. So that's what I would do. And you're asking about what would be the most fun. That would be the most fun, rather than just sitting there and editing everything perfectly and then recording a vocal and then tuning it all perfectly. Record instruments, listen to them. See if they're slightly out of time, nudge them in. See if something is, maybe there's a note or two out of tune. Tune the note or two that's really obviously out of tune. Don't go in there and just tune the vocal for the sake of it. That is a big, big deal. Using your ears to teach you how to use your DAW. That's a good one, isn't it? Use your ears to teach you what you need to learn. And I think if you do that and just use it as a giant recorder with editing capabilities, as opposed to an editor with recording capabilities, I think you'll be in a good space. What workflow would be most efficient in mixing a live recording from a concert? Do you create a template and mix each track based on the template, or treat the entire recording as one session and automate for each song? Or other ideas and tips? First of all, I've done a snizzle ton of live mixing. Big bands like Black Veil Brides, I mixed their live DVD called Alive and Burning. I mixed the Red Hot Chili Peppers live. I mixed the Ramones live. I did a Joe Strummer DVD. I've done full concerts. I've done festival, you name it. I've done tons and tons of live mixing. It's a lot of fun, but you're sort of touching on the way it works. If you've got a live band and you've got, you know, essentially a lead vocal, a drum kit, and a bass player that 90% of the time don't change the tonality. I can't remember going to a show where a drummer changed snare drum in the middle of a set, but it may happen. Most of the time, you get that drum kit to sound fantastic on one of the songs in the set. You can then apply it to the other settings. You get that bass to sound absolutely amazing. You can run through the set. Then you're into automation. Guitar, to a certain extent, could be the same as well. Now, obviously, guitar players can really get crazy with parts. One minute they could be playing a massive distorted sound, next minute a tiny funk sound. So you are going to have to mix those quite differently. And vocals have the issue maybe of bleed coming in, which you may want to automate the worst of it out. But bear in mind, when you're mixing vocals, you cannot just pull all of that stuff out to silence, because the bleed on stage in most situations is pretty bad into a vocal mic, especially a very dynamic vocal performer. I remember mixing Anthony Kiedis, and he's spinning around on stage. And as he's spinning around on stage, you get different levels of hi-hat and cymbals going. He's like, give it away, and he's spinning around. I mean, that makes it really, really difficult to mix. So what did I have to do? I had to try and get in there and do a little bit of dynamic EQ, a bit of multi-band, but the reality was, the more I pulled out, the more I made the vocal sound like that. Give it away. So what did I do? I let a lot of it just happen. I let a lot more come through than you would imagine, and it actually worked. It sounded much better than cutting all of this stuff out in between. So you learn the tolerances, and you realize that live is live, and sometimes it just has to feel a little wrong, but in a really good way. You're always going to have to do detail work on vocals. There's no like one size fits all. Here's the vocal sound, off you go. Unless you're in the most incredible environment where maybe the singer was baffled off or something, there's going to be bleed. There's going to be excessive stuff going into the lead vocal mic. Maybe on a massive, massive stage, you can get away with it. I've had a couple of things I've mixed. I mixed some live Aerosmith stuff, the Live in Japan stuff I mixed. And I remember Steven, it's pretty low on stage. Joe's fairly loud. Steven's on in-ears. I believe Joey's kit was surrounded by, you know, those clear baffles. And it wasn't a huge amount of bleed, so you could get in there with Steven's mic and keep it fairly isolated. It wasn't too bad, but essentially most live situations, small clubs, pubs, you know, venues like that, there's going to be a ton of bleed on the vocal mic, and you just have to sit there and automate gently and try to get rid of the worst of it, but realizing you can't get rid of it entirely, and just embrace it and realize it's going to be part of the live feel. There will be a few situations where the singer might come in and retrack. That has happened. I did have to mix a Frey Live at Abbey Road album or EP a few years ago, and the bleed from the drums and the vocals was just insane. It was just incredible. You know, Isaac was sitting at the piano and the drum kit was just like there, and it was just like the vocal mic might as well have been the drum mic. And we did some fun stuff, but we didn't get to do any re-singing. There's always challenges. The drum sound can be the drum sound in a live situation. You'll probably find if you get that drum sound in slamming, it will work on every song. It may be that they change the performance kind of texture quite dramatically. Maybe the drummer plays super softly, goes to brushes, hot rods or something. Maybe something will change. But essentially, 90% of the time, the drum sound will be the drum sound. The same with the bass, but you may want to automate. Guitars, changing pedals, etc. Vocals is always going to be a bit of an issue. Keys, it really depends. Are they going through an amp? Are they going through the PA? If they're going through the PA, they're very isolated. The reality is like, yes, I do create a template. Understand, so all my songs are in a row from a live set. I've got song number one, I've got the audience, I'll crank it up, I'll put some verb on it, I'll make the audience sound huge, yeah, screaming after a song, then they'll duck down, the next song will come in. If there's moments in the middle of a song where the crowd's singing along, I'll take the crowd mics, push them up, add more verb, make it sound even bigger than it was, make it feel like you're actually in the venue. All of these are the kind of tricks you do. So you're doing a lot of automation, but you're probably keeping, relatively speaking, the same drum sound. You're relatively keeping the same bass sound. Relatively keeping maybe some keys and synth stuff that's, you know, DI'd and clean. Maybe you're just volume riding it. It's going to be all about changes in guitar parts and particularly the vocals. So I like to do that. I like to do it in a row and just kind of keep the settings going along, because you don't want to start from scratch every single time. When you go and see a live band, of course there's changes, but it's nothing like listening to an album. They're not changing the snare every track. They're not changing the snare from the verse to the chorus. They're not using a different drum set on every track. The reality is like you can adopt things from one song to another. I want to have the amp in the control room for tracking and the cab in the live room. How many meters of cable can I use without losing tone? And which cable do you recommend, and how do you do it? So we're running about a 10-meter long speaker cable, which isn't excessively long, but it definitely isn't short. I don't personally like to run long guitar cables. We've tried out many cables. And the cables we've been preferring now for about 2 years now are wire world cables. They're not the cheapest cables. However, we work on the theory of like buy one really nice guitar cable and keep it forever. So far, it's been about 2 years and they've not broken. The cables we used to use before that, clots, were equally as amazing. I do think the wire world may have the edge, and we are actually doing a test that we can share with people so you can find out for yourself. But we love the cables. They sound amazing. A lot of people I know that do things like impulse responses and have to do recordings that are very scientific and really want the most lossless cable around always talk about using wire world. There's a whole fight and in an audiophile kind of world that I do not want to get into. I do not want to open up a can of worms of audiophiles here, but I will say high quality cables, at least the best you can afford. How about that? The best you can afford are definitely worth doing. A cheap cable is going to sound like a cheap cable. I've had the experience. I think we talked about it years ago when I was doing the Aerosmith record, and I split into like 5 different locations. We had to run one 200-foot cable, and it literally went crang, all the high end died from this hugely long guitar cable. So we did buy a very expensive cable and run it the distance, and the difference was enormous. I mean, we just recorded like 3 strums on a cheap cable, 3 strums on a really expensive, very expensive cable, and the difference was enormous. You know, on very long cable runs, it can make a huge difference. I personally would stick to speaker cable runs, not long guitar cable runs. Also, guitar cables for us, I like to have the amp head in the room and the cab out there, like you're suggesting, which means logically that is going to be a longer speaker cable. A shorter guitar cable, you know, being able to turn around and just grab my Marshall and set up a sound is just a really wonderful thing to be able to do. That's my honest advice. That's how we do it. To be honest, that's how most people I know that have amp racks and cabs do it. They run a longer speaker cable and shorter guitar cables. If I think of Tim Pierce, Bob Marlette, Ulrich Wilde, yeah, all those guys that are great guitar players or do great guitar recordings, you know, they're running longer speaker cables and shorter guitar cables. How accurate would you expect a studio musician to be timing-wise? Can a musician play so perfectly that time alignment is unnecessary? Yes, because a great musician has a thing called feel. They know how to push and pull. You know, it's like, I was talking about this with Victor Indrizzo a long time ago. I remember Victor did a drum track for me, and he started the downbeat on the chorus ever so slightly early. But then 2 bars in, he was settled and absolutely perfect on. I realized that it felt better. And he did a fill with a gap and a break, and he sped up the fill. So it was like, so when the downbeat hit, it felt late, but it wasn't. It was on. It was like, it was just like, wow, it felt so good. And I realized he was playing perfectly in time with feel and groove. If I slowed it down essentially and didn't give it that explosive Keith Moon drum fill feel, then that downbeat wouldn't have sounded as heavy and as meaningful. And if I had taken that downbeat of the previous chorus and put it on, it wouldn't have felt like it was punching early into the chorus. So that to me is a musician playing in time but with groove and feel. So to answer your question, yes, you could get a musician that might just go rang, dang, dang, click, 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 perfectly in time, but it also might sound like absolute poop but you might get somebody who pushes and pulls the timing a little bit and adds excitement to it. So in my humble opinion, I would trust, Victor Andrizzo in a room with Sean Hurley or Dan Rothschild or John Button or Blair Sinter with those guys, one of those kind of high-level drummers, those great players. I would trust their performance with the bass player more than I would trust editing it in time. They have feel, they have groove, they've played with the best musicians in the world, and they bring passion and performance to everything they do. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Please hit the like button, hit the notifications bell if you haven't already. And of course, you can go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. We'll see you all again very, very soon.